All right, so again, the theme of today is interacting with servers, interacting with other points on the web. How do we retrieve data from other websites? How is that data transferred? What is the set of rules that govern how that works? Because if the website, if you're requesting a website built in India or China, or someone likewise there is requesting something in the US, how is that consistent? How do we all have the same rules that govern this? So that's really what we're going to go over. What are the rules that govern those interactions? Once we know the rules and how they work, we're kind of free to play. It all starts off with JSON. Does anyone know what JSON stands for?
JavaScript Object Notation.
JavaScript Object Notation. Yes. So for the longest time, data was transferred over the web many different ways. Sometimes they'd send you the whole HTML page, a type of data language called XML. It's pretty heavy to do that. You're sending a lot of data. So something that's a bit newer, it's been around for a while now, but it's constantly gaining more and more traction, and it's kind of the standard now for transferring data across the web is JSON. You don't send the entire web page when someone makes a request in like a React application. An object or an array of objects is sent instead, and you turn that into something the user sees. So you think Twitter, all the tweets that you see on the page, that's just an array of objects that the front end is receiving and then turning into a list of items that you can interact with. JavaScript object notation, or JSON, is very lightweight because it's just a one giant string. So JSON is a string. And we can turn anything into a JSON, any data type except functions. So strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, objects, they can all be transferred via JSON. Well, where have we seen JSON before? Package.json, it's a JSON file. Now that's not because of Node interacting with servers or anything. That is just the file extension Node decided to use as like their main manifest file for any project you make in Node. It's a decision made by the people that made it. But JSON is its own file extension. So we see package.json. If we want to make our own JSON file, I'll just name it something ambiguous like data.json. And you kind of see those brackets. That's the kind of the symbols for JSON. And now I have a JSON file. So, well, again, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So when you create a JSON file, you don't declare variables, you don't do anything like that. You open an object. And that's what you're building. Just like the package JSON. If we went to that file, I'll npm init JS-y just so we can see it. Notice it's just an opening and closing object bracket with key value pairs. What is different between a JavaScript object and a JSON object? What visual things are you seeing that are different?
Quotes on the parameter.
Yeah, or the keys. Yeah. So all the keys have double quotes. It has to have they have to be double quotes. It's a strict syntax of JSON. What else about the values? What's something consistent about those as well?
Those strings.
So these are all strings. Fortunately for numbers and booleans, you can write them as their true data type. But if it's a string, you have to have double quotes. So everything in JSON is double quotes, key value pairs, unless we have other data types. So let's look at what those would look like. We'll start off with string. So I'll just say name Joe, and that's valid JSON. Now, just like a JavaScript object, if I'm going to add another key value pair, I have to end the line with a comma. Move to the next lines. Now let's do age, and I can just do the pure number there. That doesn't have to be a string in JSON. All right. How about a boolean like is alive? That also does not have to be a string when you're writing JSON like this. So numbers, booleans, we're fine just to do that. But notice the keys are all in double quotes. All right, an array, like friends. We would just write it per normal. We'd do an array of whatever data type it is. So I'll put some stuff in here. Frank. and maybe an object just to see that. So address. The keys of the inside of the object are also double quotes. 1, 2, 3, street, city, somewhere. Right, and that is what JSON can transfer, those 5 data types. That's it. But you can do a lot with those data types. I mean, you can make any website with this kind of data. So JSON is extremely strict. So this is valid JSON right here. If I were to add a comma after my last entry, I've now broke this file. So it's very strict. Every key value pair must have a comma after it unless it's the last key value pair of the object. That one does not. So notice this one does not have a comma after it because it's the last entry of this address object. And the address should not have a comma after it because it's the last entry of the JSON object. And it can be a little hard getting used to this syntax. So let's say I wrote this with the comma and I wanted to make sure that it works. What I would need to do is I'd copy this JSON, so Command C, and there's a website called JSONlint, JSONlint.com, and its purpose is just to validate JSON. So I'll paste it into here and hit validate, and if it down here it'll show red and that it's not valid. And tell me where. And it's saying after somewhere there was this error on line 9. It's the comma, too many commas. I'll try to validate again, and now it's telling me it's valid JSON. So this is a nice tool when you're first learning JSON syntax to make sure that you're writing it correctly. And the reason why we want to write it is because anytime you make a request from a server, the server, the way that we request, should always be sending you JSON. So this is what we're always getting back in our program is something like this, and then we can create H1 elements or div elements and put all of this data in those elements so they show up on the DOM and the user can see it. Any questions about JSON?
If you do have a second object, you do the comma, correct? Like a second main thing.
Oh, like after this one?
Yeah.
So JSON can only be a singular object.
You can't do it much.
Right, so let's say if this data file needed to be an array of objects, I'd have to orient it a little differently. What I need to do is say, okay, here's my object. It has a key called data. That is an array. And in data, we have other objects. All right, so it's still a single object, but I created a key called data that can be an array of nested objects. And now I could have multiple entries. And this is actually exactly how the data will look when we request from a server. Almost all the time, we use a package called Axios, which we'll be getting in on Monday, where every time a response comes back from a server, it'll come back as response.data, which is the data we requested. So it'll almost look like this exactly. And we could loop over this array and get the data out of it. Now you can't iterate over a JSON array or an object. Why? What data type is JSON again, technically? Yeah, it's a string. And you can't loop over a string like you would an array of objects. I can't loop through this and say array bracket I dot name because there is no dot name in a string. So we need a way of converting JSON to JavaScript and vice versa, JavaScript to JSON. So let's open a JavaScript file here. And I'm going to import this JSON file into my JavaScript file here. I don't have to export JSON in Node. It's exported by default. So all I have to do in my app.js file is require it from the file. Now data is I'll actually call this obj or object. So what is actually being exported from the JSON file? It's this object here. So the object that I imported will have object.data. That is that array of data. But let's console log it and see. Okay. And there is my data from the JSON file.
And how now you go into like object.data.name.
Yeah, so Node did something special for us here. Notice there's no double quotes on the keys. Node will automatically convert JSON to JavaScript when you're importing it from your own JSON file. But sometimes when you're making requests from an API, certain ways that we do it, you receive JSON, you have to convert it. So let's convert this object back into JSON and then back into JavaScript to see the methods. And there are two built methods into JavaScript that allow us to do this. The first one, this is for converting JS into JSON. And we'd use the word JSON dot stringify and give it the object, right? We're turning it into a string, we're stringifying it. It's like a Harry Potter spell or something. And this will return the JSON object. So let's console log that and see the difference. All right, now what are we seeing when I console log? All the double quotes. Really, if I said type of here in console log that, it's a giant string. So right now I cannot console log, I try to console log JSON object dot data, I'm gonna get undefined because string doesn't have dot syntax. I can't index into it. So if I do receive a JSON object, I need to use a different JSON method to turn it back into JavaScript. So I'll call this JS object, and it is JSON.parse, the JSON object.
So what's that do again?
That converts JSON to JS. So JS to JSON, stringify, JSON to JS, parse. Now there's more to JSON. There are intricacies in the language. It is its own language. It's something you'd put on your resume. I know JSON. We're just covering the basics you need to know so you can interact with it and use it, but it's definitely worth more time studying when you get to that point. But this is really all you need to know about it, is how does it look, how do you write it, what's the strictness of the syntax, and then when I'm using it, how do I convert it back and forth between JavaScript and JSON. Fortunately, a lot of the packages we use for server requests do this conversion for us, just like Node. So it's only when we're handling it ourselves outside of the server context where we typically need to parse and stringify manually.
Now, why would you need to parse it again? Like if you got it in a string like that?
Yeah, like why would you turn it into JSON? Like we need JavaScript in our program, so why would you ever need to turn it to JSON?
What would, when would we have to use the third option to convert it from JSON to JavaScript?
Today, we're going to make a request to a server using a native JavaScript constructor, and that does not convert it for you when it gets the response back from the server. So then you have to parse it to JavaScript before you can use it. But once we start using Axios next week, it does that for you. Yeah. And we will get into things like local storage as well, where we save stuff on people's computers, kind of simulating a database, but it's saved on their browser. And the browser requires you to save it as JSON in the browser. So that's another place where we'll also have to manually convert it to JSON before saving it.
There's some servers that don't allow that.
Yes, there are servers, because our browsers should allow it all around now. I mean, if they're way out of date, like they're 10 places behind an Internet Explorer, they're using Opera, you're going to run into problems.
And they should.
And they should. Now, I mean, we have to make it accessible to everyone, so that's web accessibility. That's something that employers want to see you at least know the concept of. But
why is Opera so out of date?
You don't see it. I think it's one of the main browsers in Africa, I believe, or in the eastern area over there. It just doesn't have a whole lot of support because of the minimal users, but it's still a large enough user base that we need to account for it. Yeah. 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 We'll improve Opera. Okay. So you will have an exercise with this. Let me